Hi, everybody. Welcome back to our study of Ovid's Metamorphoses. Here we are in books 4, 5, and 6. And I start with a quote from the beginning of that sixth book. Their tale was done, and now the Muses won Minerva's praise. She had listened carefully, and she applauded all their artistry and song. And of course, this then initiates what we will have this reminiscence of the Arachne and Minerva weaving contest. So it kind of segues from one of these stories, a beautiful muse-sung composition, and goes into a contest where Minerva herself, the goddess associated with weaving here, has a way in which she now finds a challenger of her own. Remember, the Muses had just sort of defeated the Pierides in their song and converted them, transformed them into magpies. So here too, then we get the story of Arachne that has, a similar tint to it, but goes in a different direction itself. So I think that it's a meditation on the artist, on artistry, and on representations of art and artistry in different contests, and there are good meditations in Ovid's Metamorphoses about those sorts of things. And these are some of the questions that I want us to continue to ponder as we read this. Again, if it's not necessarily a clear A, B, C, D, E, F narrative, we're very much, it's almost watery and difficult to pin down. How do we have what's the overarching storyline here? Again, we said if some of these threads are tied together by certain themes, what are some other angles that we can take in trying to read this as a unified whole to the extent that we can? Well, one of them is, as we said, the representations of art and artistry. And we've already talked about, for instance, in the Iliad or in the Aeneid, where you have representations, meditations of a work of art that's described in words in a very full description. Those are called ekphrases. This is the singular of that is an ekphrasis. If you want to use it as an adjective, you would say there's an ekphrastic description or an ekphrastic account, something like that with that adjective. But that is to say this is a description of a work of art within the written word. So this is when we're talking about, say, the tapestry of Arachne, which we just mentioned. That would be in Ovid's description called an ekphrasis, the ekphrastic description of Arachne's tapestry or of Minerva's tapestry, any of those sorts of things. So we can think about what those representations do and what that might mean for representation of the artist himself. Remember, Ovid having a bit of self-commentary sometimes. We remember from the Aeneid, for instance, that Virgil included tellingly the poets in the Elysian fields in the underworld, saying that they were, among the blessed. And of course, he, as a poet writing it, might have a certain thing or two to say about that, or representations of the singing bard in the Odyssey or in the Iliad, especially the Odyssey there. So we can think about those kinds of questions, self-representation amidst this. And remember, because Ovid would be exiled for his self-styled Carmen et Error, that sort of the love poetry perhaps that ran against the grain of the Augustan regime, as well as his, potentially personal interactions. There are ways in which, he says, well, maybe there's a kind of censorship that goes on, and so how do we deal with censorship, artistry, and other questions as we see them in a lot of these stories that we get, particularly in this section now, but throughout the work, really, overall. Again, we consider questions of power dynamics and different relationships. You have speech and force that are often put one against the other. Lack of speech, you go into silence. We'll talk about the Philomela, Procne, Tereus story. Physical force, this is so many of the things that we've seen, for instance, in Jupiter's interactions, resorting certainly just to sheer force and violence. You can think about the questions in the Metamorphoses about the structure of the work and how this all goes, not, as we said, not necessarily in a linear fashion so much as in a cyclical one. And you can kind of almost feel like you're going over and over again. If you've ever seen the movie Inception, you can kind of get a bit of that feel in literary written form here in the Metamorphoses, because it's almost as though we're in a song within a song, or a story within a story. And you don't know where one begins, the next ends. And how did you get into the story that you are now? Well, it was only off a winding path that was only tangentially related to a previous story, because it happened to take place at a similar place or passed by some stream or some spring, which has this metamorphosis associated with it. So all of these are links that are, very difficult sometimes to trace. And you'll find yourself in the middle of a story and say, who is telling this story? Who's hearing the story? Where are we? So I think that there is something intentional behind that, and I urge you to consider those questions. Remember too that in the ancient world, we wouldn't have the luxury of these editorial marks. We see double quotation mark, then single quotation mark to say, okay, it's a quote within a quote. Ancient world didn't even have quotation marks. Hardly did they even use spaces. They had interpuncts sometimes. But the idea is, as Ovid's making this is one story within the next that you almost can't tell who's saying what. So we're fortunate that we have Mandelbaum as our editor giving us quotation marks and saying, okay, now someone starts speaking, now someone ends speaking, and this is someone speaking within a speech. So there are ways in which we can kind of help ourselves today, but it's clear that Ovid is doing something quite funny or let's say artful, skillful, certainly confusing at times when he's doing these things. And in addition to allusions to other works, Ovid will also put in self-referential allusions. So he will kind of refer back to earlier sections, even of his own work, or even if he doesn't do that expressly, sometimes he invites comparison with earlier episodes. And a couple of those come up in this particular section of the work. So it's worth thinking about those kinds of questions. We get some famous stories here. I hope you like the Pyramus and Thisbe story, because of course it will have been very familiar to us already under a different name. We might also call it the story of Romeo and Juliet, because of course this is something that is a major inspiration to Shakespeare. We might say, okay, there's a different the mulberry tree is kind of the factor there, or they share walls between their homes. They share a single wall, and they kind of speak between the crack there. But it's clear that Shakespeare is taking quite a lot of inspiration from the Metamorphoses. And that's true, by the way. I mean, Shakespeare is a very keen reader of Ovid, so we get a lot of mythological items that go into Shakespeare coming from Ovid. So it's worth reading through the Metamorphoses to sort of enrich our understanding of some of the things that we get in Shakespeare. And that's certainly true for this Pyramus and Thisbe story. I won't go into much of the details because, of course, we know that general broad outline. But I think it might be worth thinking on some of the differences between the Shakespearean account and the Ovidian one. We have also seen a story similar already to one that we've seen in earlier works in the Mars, Venus, and Vulcan episode, where again we get the story of Vulcan, we have Venus and Vulcan married, but Mars and Venus are having their extramarital tryst. And so how does this Vulcan, in trying to catch them in the act, has this extremely finely woven net that he places over the bed, and once they touch it, it springs into action, and they're suspended, caught in the net, caught in the act. And so that's one story that we've already seen from the Odyssey, when we had a similar story. Of course, you've changed from the Roman names back to the Greek names to get to that Odyssey story, but it is one that we've seen. So this are ways in which Ovid is noting, hey, listen, I'm very well versed in this whole, Homeric tradition, let's say, and I'm also keenly aware of the artistic moments or moments of commentary on artistry, such as that finely woven web that Vulcan does, or anything like that. That he can, he's engaging with that tradition and commenting on it in his own subtle and sometimes self-aggrandizing or ways. Other stories in here are good ones to think on. The Leucothea and the Sun episode. If we think that the Mars, Venus, and Vulcan story gets at a little bit of the Ovid's allusions to other works, the Leucothea episode with the Sun, I think, invites comparison within other stories in the Metamorphoses. So Ovid referring to himself and his own works, his own same poem, just earlier moments from it now being on display in Book 4. Because if you think about it, if we've already discussed a triad that that I think is worth noting, is those three episodes of Io, Callisto, and Europa. I've written on those. I think those are books 1, 2, and 3 that we kind of encounter those stories and those women. What do we get in Book 4? But now the Leucothea episode here, where she, similarly, the Sun, enamored of her. Now, and you can even find this the story itself, the Leucothea story. I've lost my page here. But in either case, it blends some of those elements of the earlier stories that we've seen from let's say Jupiter, where you get, for instance, elements from like the Callisto episode where Jupiter comes in the guise of Diana, right? So he comes in a disguise. So too the sun god comes in as though the mother to say, okay, all you other ones now leave the looms behind. I just want to have a one little mother-daughter conversation here. And of course, that's all, some kind of pretext and complete fabrication. So there are ways in which those elements come in. There are references back, and then once upon her death, then the son weeps as he hadn't been this sad since the death of his son Phaethon, which we saw in that books 1 and 2 story. So all of those are kind of callbacks to his own work. So instantiating this dream within a dream sort of a deal. We get another moment, and there's almost a cinematic quality to some of these Perseus saga stories, where Perseus, of course, we get some of his different daring-do feats, but we also get references to his defeating of the Gorgon Medusa, of course, whose story we know. Her gaze turns whoever makes eye contact with her to stone. Well, what happens here? We kind of see a little bit of a foreshadowing of, within the story. He's already said, like, and by the way, I've already, of course, defeated that Gorgon Medusa. We haven't yet heard the Gorgon tale, that Medusa tale, until the very end of that series, or about, let's say, the penultimate story within that series of stories. So it's, again, the storytelling technique is just as important as many of the stories themselves. We can think more on that precise process, especially in book 5, because we get really, this is an extended meditation of story within a story. So I think it's really, really worth diving into this book. I'll leave you to do much of that on your own, but I think that is a lot of artistry here to say, when we have Minerva, who, of course, this is a classic example of having left the Perseus saga. Then we get Minerva going off in her direction, and she has an encounter with the Muses. And she talks about, she learns of the Muses' battle with the Pierides, again, these all other singers who have been turned to magpies, these birds. And we get so we're hearing Minerva addresses the Muses, and the Muses tell her the story. Oh yeah, this is how those birds over there, who used to be singers, became birds, because we defeated them in a contest that they challenged us to. And then, by the way, what happened within that story is we each we had a contest of singers singing songs to the other. And so you're kind of lost within this narrative. You have the Muses speaking to Minerva. The Muses are quoting, let's say, one of their number. So of the 9 Muses, maybe the muse who's speaking to Minerva says, my sister Callisto then began speaking this song. And then within that song, within that story, we have, oh yes, Arethusa then said the following. So it's embedded narratives, double quote, single quote, double quote. It really folds in on itself. So really dive into book 5, I think, is a worthwhile exercise. This famous story of Ceres and Proserpina occurs there. We would have known them as the goddess of grain, of course, and then her daughter, the queen of the underworld. As it turns out, we get the pomegranate idea. We've seen this in the Greek version as well. As we get, of course, her Proserpina being Persephone in the Greek, and so that underworld episode. But what else happens here? We move to book 6, for instance, and these are some of the, again, meditations, especially on, we've talked about sort of power dynamics. We've talked about speech and violence and silence and other things. And so these are stories which put those directly on display. We have the story of Procne, Philomela, and Tereus to kind of close out our selection. We start in book 6, as we already quoted, this Arachne and Minerva tale, where it's, again, a meditation on artistry and the role of the artist and sort of censorship as it comes in. Arachne, who kind of has this in-your-face kind of attitude almost, right, as we'll note in some of the stories, kind of saying, look at what you've done. Look at the terrible things that the divinities have done, and some of which we've read about in the Metamorphoses themselves. So it's kind of, again, story within a story. And so Arachne, goes to Minerva with those things and says, look how terrible these things are. It's a kind of meditation that we ourselves are invited into for the entirety of the Metamorphoses, in a sense. We're seeing all these terrible, terrible things that are happening at the hands of the divine against mortals. And why is that? Likewise, you get the Procne, Philomela, and Tereus story. Again, terrible, terrible things wrought. Brings in a lot of mythological aspects of feeding one's children to the parent and terrible heartbreak all around. And so all this is very difficult material in some ways, in a lot of ways, really. But I hope, too, that it gets us thinking on the role of artistry and the poetry that goes into it. And so it hopefully sparks us into some bigger questions and broader discussions. Thank you very much. I hope you're enjoying reading Ovid. See you soon.